1858, and September 13th, and then September 15th, two events happened near each other, one in Illinois, one in Ohio, that seemingly had disparate issues going on, just two seemingly random type of things. There's no evidence that then hopeful senator candidate Abraham Lincoln or Senator Douglas knew of the event in Ohio. But these two events were two events that, as you look at the road to the Civil War, were signal events that how close the country was to its final push into what we could call a great crisis. You get far enough back, you can begin to see what seems to be something of a pattern. Is that when you get to the end of the pattern, there are clues that can signal us. The cycle can be seen in a variety of different ways. And I like to start it thinking with seasons. This isn't unique to me, by the way. So with spring, which again, here in Florida, we kind of don't get all this because our spring is different than everybody else's spring in very temperate areas like ourselves. Okay? But in general, if you think of a normal kind of idea of seasons, spring is what? The birth of new life. If you can think of this not starting in a punctiliar way, but just we're picking it up just midstream, right? Then what's preceded spring, of course, is winter. So in the cycle, what's preceded spring is the crisis. Now here's the good news. Let me just give this part now. Don't hear me talk about, wow, we may be headed to an explosive crisis, and then think doom and gloom. The reality is, even when you go back to some of the major moments in national history, or global history, so for instance, the bubonic plague is one of the best examples. Most people live through it. So then, on living through it, what is the feeling? The feeling is relief. The feeling is some sense of joy, the coming of spring. Spring leads the summer. Summer is kind of the flowering in the pattern with what Strauss and Howe noted with something that other groups had not noticed before, which is what was most compelling to me, is why I'm a big believer in kind of their view of that pattern, which is what I hold to, is that offsetting the crisis by roughly 40-ish years is a high, a spiritual high, that in American history we typically call great awakenings, and they have almost always been linked to Christianity. And that's accurate historically, but I don't want you to get trapped into liking or not liking Christianity. But just think in terms of kind of the spiritual sense of a renewal, of questioning, of seeking for purpose, seeking deeper morals, and to some degree, perhaps sometimes challenging older views from a previous time. After summer, of course, as already said, comes fall. With fall begins the decay. This is the unraveling section. And what happens is coming out of the kind of spiritual high, you come to this moment when now people have begun to ask deeper questions about how society lives. And then that leads ultimately to a crisis. Along the way, what's happening is underneath it is there begins to emerge a philosophical divide amongst the people living as to how do we live, we might say best or well. A generation is always a 20 to 25-year window of time, and it's those who are born in there at a time when culture is doing certain things to itself. Now, 4 generational archetypes. These archetypes go through history for the same 500 years. The point for us is that the archetypes, the generations, and the cycle work connected together. The philosophical divide comes down to changing things. And this is the big takeaway with the Great Crisis. The explosion does answer the questions. It is solved when we get there. So for instance, and we're going to go just back to the time of the 1600s. Strauss and Howe go further back, but for our purposes, we're just going to go right there because it's much more American focused. Okay? The debate is Parliament versus King. When it's over, the king is gone, and they go from an absolute monarchy to a legislative monarchy. 80, 90, 85 years later, the same debate happens, this time in North America, except now the debate is between a king at all or government of the people. The battle is fought, the divide is wrestled over, and they get to the other side, representative government. 80 years later, 7 years ago, the same debate happens. This time it's about how powerful the government should be, and has the government of, say, Jackson and eventually Lincoln become too powerful compared to what we had originally signed up for back in the 1770s. But once the philosophical divide is taken over, people become too determined. Now remember, what are they fighting over? their view of civic best. So now they realize, I cannot compromise with you because you can't have a king and not a king. So there's just no way to compromise on that issue. You can't have slavery and not slavery. So once I've decided this philosophical position has become something I will go to the death for, I'll go to the death for it. And I will not compromise with you. And I'm an issue of compromising you. And I think you're wrong and probably evil. And so what do you do with evil? You banish evil. So that's how we always flow towards this crisis point. In fact, most historians would agree with these years go, yep, that's the moment. And when you tie it into what I think is the bigger deal, which is that there's always some massive systemic cultural change on the other side of it, well, then even more so. You go, wow, yeah, that is them. So, my contribution is that let's look for these clues, and I will offer to you that there are 12 clues that happen every time. Europe and England in the 1600s is in a time of massive change. They're trying to answer some deep questions about religion and about government. And they've had a massive civil war called the English Civil War. So their philosophical divide is that they're coming out of the time of the Renaissance, and they've had the first really political theorists, Thomas Hobbes and John Locke, writing about what government should look like. And for the first time, there's this question of, do we really think that there should be a king? Is a king what is best for civic society? That's what they're debating. Obviously, if you are the king, the answer to that question is pretty simple, and you've got an opinion. Because it's your job that's on the chopping block. Right? So, 12 attributes. War starts the conflict. French New War, very successful. Should have happened, or not. Massive debt. Weak government leadership, as I told you, 5 prime ministers in 7 years. Tumult. Just upheaval. It doesn't help also that at this very moment, the colonists are exerting strong leadership. Not just strong in that we're closer, we're more powerful than you, but it was actually good leadership. One of the things I teach the students is like, why were they able to pull this off when you stand back and look at it, is that we have, for whatever reason, God, fate, good luck, whatever you want to go with, the most amazing constellation of leaders that except for maybe Washington, you could have gotten rid of all the top 50 that are famous and the second bench level group that were all in the various states. These are amazing. And had the women been allowed to contribute, you had this other group of amazing leaders like Abigail Adams, who's just the most famous, who were brilliant in their own right. And so you have this sense where, the Americans have this constellation of amazing leaders, and then you've got these guys and the poor prime ministers who are struggling to kind of pull things off. These three are always linked, right? So you can imagine, you can see it, going into too much depth. The idea of weak government leadership, making poor government decisions that then leads the people to feel like the government doesn't know us. You see how those are all tied together. And so again, every time in the Great Crisis, this attribute kind of comes back up again. The explosion in Ohio led one of Ohio's native sons, who had grown up 10 miles from the city of Oberlin, a man named John Brown, who had already gone out to Kansas and kidnapped some slaveholding families and executed them, chopped them up with swords, and freed their slaves. Got a group of people to ride from Ohio down to Virginia to a place called Harper's Ferry, which was a federal arsenal. Many of the members of the rescuers went with him. The first 2 people who were killed, one an African American, were rescuers from the John Price Oberlin Wellington Rescue. And they thought he was captured. It's hard to tell with John Brown what he was thinking, but in general terms, it looks like he wanted to get captured. And so he used this moment to make his speech, and then, shockingly, he's executed by the state of Virginia. Remember, he attacked a federal arsenal. To people in the North, the execution by the Virginians was a signal that the slave power could not be stopped by any other way. They would not follow the rules. To the people of the South, the fact of John Brown coming showed them that the abolitionists didn't care what the laws were. They were going to come in and attack us and even kill us in our sleep. Change in communication is the emergence of the telegraph. Now, all of a sudden, within 24 hours, instead of Bleeding Kansas happening, and maybe a week later it gets to your newspaper, and then maybe a week later you read about it or hear about it at church, and then get mad, depending which side you're on, within 24 hours, 48 at the most, it was in everybody's newspaper. And all these events and decisions that were being made were happening at a faster pace, which then picked up the speed of how we kind of went down this process. This one's also complicated when you say, what's the Great Crisis explosion? Because you have both the domestic issue, which seems more familiar to the others, the Great Depression, And the crisis does not have to be war. Don't think of the American Revolution as a war. There was a war that went with it. I think the Civil War, you'd call that a war. But the first two are political debates, and then this one's an economic debate. So Strauss and Howe are really clear to show that the crisis we go to may not be war. Don't look for a firing on Fort Sumter kind of thing when I've had this conversation. So in that progressivism, we go in to help, and Wilson made all these wonderful speeches in 1916, that yes, it's a good thing we do this. By 1919, it was like you drunk sour milk, but you didn't know it until you swallowed it. And so there was this big backlash. We don't even sign his own treaty. We refuse to participate. The Senate does not engage. And we basically back out of this progressive mindset. At the same time, the government does these kind of overreaching things like prohibition, which may have come from a laudable point of view. Yeah, I think it does. But it was a complete overreach of a typical progressive mind. You can't figure out how to quit drinking. You can't stop yourself from beating your wife and abandoning your children, so we're going to take care of this problem all at once. We know best. Weak government leadership, particularly when Hoover gets confronted with the Depression. Although, like I tell my students, Jesus could have been our president in 1929. He wouldn't solve that either. If FDR had been the president in 29 and Hoover had been the president in 32, we would laud Hoover today and we'd demonize FDR. Nobody was getting out of that mess. And they didn't really know what hit them. It's October, November 29. All through 30, they don't really understand what's happening. Finally, about 31, they're starting to go, this is kind of bad. And they start taking baby steps to fix it, but they don't take enough baby steps. So you just arguably, and they made it worse with they passed the Hawley-Smoot Tariff Act, thinking a tariff would protect American industries, but all it did was ruin our exports, as it always does. President Obama said this great speech in his first inauguration. He's a wonderful speaker, and this was one of his best speeches. And he was trying to call us to our historic values. And so he says it. The values upon our success as a nation depends hard work and honesty, courage and fair play, tolerance and curiosity, loyalty and patriotism. These things are old. These things are true. I think he's accurate. He's saying, hey, we've lost something. He's saying this in 2008. We've lost something. I think that's fair. I think Congress has really been the ones, again, not trying to throw stones, just saying how we matched it. Again, you don't have to agree, but I think Congress in general, and particularly when you look at both under President Bush and President Obama, when their parties controlled all the houses. New political voices, see like The Daily Show, Real Time with Bill Maher, Glenn Beck's thing, The Blaze, all the talk radio people, I think, would be in that same arena of that kind of explosive writing that galvanizes people. Explosive events, the Muslim travel ban, the tariffs, like you said back there, they decided to build a wall. All these things have galvanized opposition as they're coming out of the leadership, and then people are on both sides of the philosophical divide. I would just say I don't think we've got I don't feel like there's a clear signal as to what the philosophical divide is, because we have too many choices. I use the title of my book, I said, Tracking the Storm, because I live in Florida, and we track hurricanes. And to me, that has always been the best way to think of it. And so then, when I think, well, what do I do about it? How do I prepare? This is what I try to say to them. But don't panic. Because panic won't do anything about it. Right? You can't, the storm's coming. It just is. All you can do is prepare. And again, I would offer for myself, as a father of 3, and hopefully one day soon, because they're all college kids and they're a little older than college kids, my grandfather, I have hope. We lived through it. The bulk of us lived through it. And then we pick up the pieces and move forward with whatever it was that divided us, typically being